the functions of sleep now. Yeah, this is a relatively short section. We need to hit a foundation here. A bunch of this stuff we're going to hit later, especially memory. Memory is going to be a big part of the section when we get to dreams later, which is why you may notice we're not going to spend as much time on it here. You see a graph here of the body and the different areas that are impacted by sleep deprivation. We're not going to talk sleep deprivation yet here. That's our sleep disorders and deprivation are our next section after this. But areas that are affected by sleep deprivation give us a sign as to what is restored through normal sleep. So we're going to first look here at the physical part, the body, as far as physical restoration during sleep. Now, there's a big obvious key here is that when you're asleep, your body is motionless, it's at rest, you're using less energy. Therefore, anything your body needs to do to kind of pick up and restore things or heal things, it has a greater chance to do that. We're going to see on a later slide, so I'm going to hit it right now. Restoration and maintenance processes in the body don't have to compete as much with other systems for energy when the body is at rest. So a couple things going on here. We have an increase in hormones related to anabolic processes, a decrease in the hormones related to catabolic processes, restoration of hormones and neurotransmitters. We're going to hit a couple of those specifically later. So as it says in the slide, I'm oversimplifying this just for the sake of what we're talking about here. When we talk about the anabolic processes, we're talking about things that help build and repair or generate. Catabolic processes, essentially for our purposes, are the ones that release energy. So obviously, if you're in a down phase, you're not physically using the body, you're not consciously trying to direct the brain, which increases resource used by the brain. Those systems are not going to use as much resource. Therefore, the anabolic processes kind of get a head start. Think about it on a job where you're getting a lot of new tasks thrown at you, and you get a break in the new tasks coming at you. Those briefly stop. It lets you get caught up on what you have built up over time and kind of get ahead. So again, with those physical processes limited, some main areas that don't have to compete as much for resource and therefore can do more. Digestion essentially kind of slows itself during sleep. But we had mentioned last time, one of the things that can kind of make you tired after a big meal is the digestive system pulling resource in to try to handle that, drawing energy away that you have available for other things. The immune system can build up and work harder if energy is not being drawn by other issues. Tissue repair is a big one here. And the transfer of nutrients and expulsion of waste through the cells can pick up here. We're going to see in a moment, we actually have a brief video we're going to show in a little while on how the brain handles that during sleep. It seems during sleep is when the brain is flushing most of its toxins out. Which brings the question on this other slide. How is the brain getting restored if it's still functioning? The brain is still doing its things. It's very active. It has some low level periods, but as we mentioned in REM sleep, it's about as active as it is when you're awake. And this is where we have to kind of come back to conscious awareness and conscious direction, right? The brain itself, as Ravanzo mentioned at the beginning of the second video, he talked about how life is a dream guided by the senses, meaning your brain kind of wants to do its own stream of consciousness thing all the time, just follow random firing paths as they fire. But we interrupt that through information from the senses, and we consciously direct where we want our attention to go. We work to maintain it. So think about when you're concentrating hard on a task, you are directing a lot of neural resource toward that task, and you are burning a lot of resource while you do it. The brain is, of the organ systems in the body, the brain is one of the biggest consumers of resource in the entire body. You can literally get tired from thinking hard or concentrating hard over a sustained period of time because you're burning a lot of resource. Once that conscious direction is gone and the brain can run on its own, it actually has more efficient use of energy and a lower level of energy processing, so it can do a lot of its restoration during there. Now, that doesn't mean it would be good for your brain just to sit and space out all the time. Conscious direction is a key in what we call synaptogenesis, the forming of new synaptic connections. Pruning, which is getting rid of connections you don't use anymore. It's actually good for the brain itself to do that, but it's also good for it to have some downtime. Again, lack of conscious direction allows for better processing. And again, memory processing is one of those. We'll get to that shortly. So, stage 3 sleep. Remember we mentioned we have 3 stages, 1, 2, 3 that we go down to. 3 is the deepest. There used to be a stage 4 there, but we now blended that into what we call stage 3. So 3 is the deepest slow wave area of sleep. That's where you get what you call the delta waves. That seems to be the point where a lot of the neural pathways start kind of, when you look at the brain waves, they start to kind of fire in unison. There's kind of a synchronous firing through there, almost like just the brain exhaling to a degree. That seems to be where toxins get released from the brain. We got a short video here talking about this, talking about the how that this actually, it's one thing to say, oh, it does it here. This one explains it in a little more detail. Let's look at this.
As we do more research into the brain, we're increasingly realizing that sleep is one of the most essential things we need to be functioning, healthy human beings. And new research looks into how sleep helps us maintain clean brains. But what does that mean? And why is that important? Well, to understand this latest news, we have to go back to 2013, when a study of mouse brains found that while those furry little rodents slept, neurotoxic waste products got swept away. Some kind of cleaning crew comes in overnight and gets rid of built-up stuff like beta amyloid, that sticky peptide that can aggregate into plaques and disrupt brain function. Amyloid plaques are highly associated with the occurrence of diseases like Alzheimer's, and the amyloid hypothesis suggests that amyloid plaques could be the primary cause of that devastating disease. So it's real nice that your brain can get rid of it while you sleep. That 2013 study saw an interesting relationship. While the mice slept, their lymphatic systems opened up. This let in a big wash of cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, which seemed to clear these waste products away. And just so you know, CSF is a watery, clear substance that surrounds your brain and spinal cord and acts kind of like a little cushion to protect your brain and provide it with nutrients. A team at Boston University took this 2013 finding and wanted to know exactly how. In this new study they published in Science, the researchers delved into what about sleep was so special. Why did a sleep state in particular allow for these changes in the brain? The team got human participants to fall asleep inside an fMRI machine, which seems like quite a feat in itself, and which let the team measure both the blood oxygen levels in the participants' brains and show the flux of cerebrospinal fluid. They also measured the electrical currents in subjects' brains using an EEG cap. The results gave the team a pretty clear answer, one that came in waves. We've been finding out more over the past several years about the phases our brains go through while we sleep, and how those phases are essential to information processing and memory formation. And it turns out it's not just during rapid eye movement sleep or REM sleep that our brains are consolidating information and committing it to our long-term memory, but they're doing it during non-REM sleep too. And in humans, these two states of sleep, REM and non-REM, alternate throughout the night. Non-REM sleep is divided into 3 stages, and that third stage is our deepest state of sleep, called slow wave sleep. During slow wave sleep, electrical activity slows down and syncs up. So our neurons start to fire in sync with one another at quite a slow frequency that neuroscientists call delta waves. And while slow wave sleep has been shown to be essential to memory formation, this latest study is the first to demonstrate exactly how those slow waves keep our brains clean and healthy. From all of their many measurements, the Boston team saw that during slow wave sleep, The brain was actually being washed by waves of cerebrospinal fluid, like a little free nighttime spa for your brain. See, when neurons start to fire in sync, they're all electrically active at the same time, and that means there's empty time in between activity. When those neurons aren't firing, they need less oxygen, so less blood is flowing to the brain, but cerebrospinal fluid comes in and fills in that extra space. So this pattern in CSF flow is intrinsically linked to neuron firing. The neurons light up, the neurons go dark, the CSF comes in, the CSF goes out. It's all very relaxing. This study not only found a direct relationship between electrical activity in the brain and this CSF cleansing mechanism, but also confirmed that an increase in CSF is linked to an increased clearing of neurotoxic waste products like beta amyloid. This indicates that sleep, and slow-wave sleep in particular, is essential to clearing out all the gunk in your brain garbage, if you will.
Yeah, so as far as neurotransmitters that are being replenished and that are necessary for sleep, we mentioned early on in the last video, GABA is a neural inhibitor. That's big for slowing things down, getting into that state of sleep. Acetylcholine, which among other things is also involved in learning and attention, one of the other things it does is regulate body temperature. And we're going to see these primary neurotransmitters, their key function as far as sleep and the necessity for sleep is the brainstem and the lower brainstem areas. So one of the things with acetylcholine, now all of these can kind of get diminished, not used up entirely, but their levels can be low if you stay awake for too long. So during sleep, these levels of these neurotransmitters get replenished and you're more functional when you wake up. I don't have dopamine on here, but dopamine is another one of those that gets replenished. In fact, all of them do. So acetylcholine, one of its things is regulating body temperature. So as it notes here on the slide, sleep deprivation, if we're just banging acetylcholine and not letting it replenish, we actually reach a point where our brain has a problem maintaining body temperature, and you actually see body temperature start to decline the more you stay awake, which is also associated with poor functioning both physically and cognitively. Norepinephrine, that is key to vigilance and focus. It's one of the arousal neurotransmitters. As it gets depleted, is that a real word? You can have problems with focus. And serotonin, overall arousal. And also serotonin is a neuromodulator. Its levels help regulate the levels of other neurotransmitters. So we basically need all of these things to get replenished, to stay as functional as we can, and to keep our body as healthy as possible. Which raises the question, why a 24-hour cycle? If you look from an evolutionary perspective, if for 7 or 8 hours a night we are just unconscious and laying there, you would think, wow, we're pretty prone to predators there. Why once every day do we have to do that? Why aren't we physically designed to just require sleep once a week and replenish during that period of time, right? We're going to hit in a minute the question of why don't we hibernate like other species do during the winter. We have the same issues of problems with food supply, things like that during the winter. Well, one of the key reasons that we don't sleep weekly and instead we have to sleep daily, as it says here, is our metabolism. We use resource very quickly. That's why we have to eat every day as well. We are using up the energy supplies we're getting pretty quickly. We're a species that has to eat fairly regularly to maintain energy and to maintain balance in the system. Because of that metabolic cycle, we also require downtime, at least every 24 hours for a period of time. So why don't we hibernate? There's some people that look at seasonal affective disorder, which for some people, for a lot of people, occurs in the winter, but seasonal affective disorder can occur at any time of the year. But a couple of the symptoms there are excessive appetite and excessive need for sleep. Some people will point at that and say, wow, that sounds like we want to hibernate during the winter. Well, those are also very common symptoms for the other mood disorders as well. They're not unique to seasonal affective disorder. But let's go back to the circadian rhythm because it's a big clue here. We mentioned how your circadian rhythm is triggered by light, specifically sunlight picked up by the eyes. Obviously, over the course of a year, the amount of sunlight changes. We have a peak of sunlight in June, and our exposure to sunlight is the least around the middle of December, second half of December. So it does seem that we are designed for our circadian rhythm to cycle with the seasons. Like other species, again, if we take an evolutionary perspective on it, during the summer, when our availability of resource would be the greatest, that's when we would be designed to be awake the longest. Bears are very similar. They do hibernate, but when they are out, well, we'll hit that in a minute, they don't quite completely hibernate. But when they are awake in the summer, they only sleep about 4 hours a day. The rest of their time is spent mainly looking for food sources. Now, I mentioned bears don't technically hibernate like other species do. Let's use insects, for example. They will truly hibernate, which means they go to sleep and all their functioning slows way down. In the case of insects, their body temperature is regulated by the environment, not necessarily internally. So you could dig up a nest of insects during the winter and just pick them up with your hands and move them, and they're not going to wake up. The difference with bears is, although they do sleep for several months, they don't go completely out the way other hibernating species do. Bears' body temperature stays a little higher than other hibernating species do. They can be awakened when they are hibernating. Now, it may be difficult to do it, but it can happen. So just because it's December doesn't mean you should say, hey, let's go into a bear cave and lay around on bears. You can actually wake them up. They'll be sluggish. Bears get gradually more sluggish as they're approaching hibernation. When they wake up, they're a little sluggish for a while afterward. But we seem to be kind of a parallel to that. We are designed to kind of have lower energy for longer periods of time as we get into the winter months, which would make sense because, again, if you don't have the same access to resource, it's going to be a benefit to you to use less energy during that time. So we may be designed to sleep more during the winter and less during the summer. But we put in a schedule. For example, your work schedule may stay very consistent no matter what time of year or how much daylight you have. So you may have a harder time working with that during the darker winter months. So we're not completely a hibernating species, but we do naturally want to follow that cycle of light. I mentioned in the previous video how in our household, without any schedule to hold to, or maybe I didn't mention it, I might be bleeding over to another class here, how we have kind of gone into a greater than 24-hour cycle. So we stay up later and later every night, and we've now gone around the clock twice since the whole stay-at-home order was put out in the spring of 2020. But that is natural. Humans actually have a natural rhythm of, as far as a day or sleep or wake cycle, that is a little more than 24 hours. So our social rhythm sets us into a pattern that kind of resets our circadian rhythm every day, essentially, to a degree. Okay, so the physical side of that, pretty straightforward. We're replenishing resource, we're clearing out waste, we're repairing things that need repaired. Physically, that's part of what's going on while we're asleep. We're flushing toxins out of the brain and actually out of the rest of the body as we go through there. So the other big one is memory processing. And this is part of the activity of the brain that you see in pretty much every level of sleep. Now, this is As the slide mentions, recently activated pathways are reinforced during sleep, and memory consolidation usually starts with the most recent things in your brain. So let's back up to memory for a minute, just in case you haven't taken general psych or a course on cognition and memory. Memories are not stored in any single place in the brain. A memory is formed by the synchronous firing of literally thousands of neural pathways. And when I say a neural pathway, I mean strings of neurons that all fired together around that time. And any number of neurons can be part of many other pathways. It's just, say at the moment that I saw the mothership hover over my city, the neural pathways that happen to be firing together at that moment are the ones that solidified the memory of that. So at any future point, if I manage to refire that pattern of pathways, or at least a sufficient percentage of them, I will recall the memory of that. And this is why, again, because some pathways are involved in multiple memories, you can have one thing that you're thinking about that starts to trigger off pieces of something else. It may not be related at all. Maybe thinking about grandma falling down the stairs at the theater somehow triggers a memory of a trip to the beach I took with some friends. And the reason for that is a lot of the pathways involved in that memory of grandma are shared by different pathways that kind of cross over from that memory from the beach. So a lot of interconnectedness there. That's one of the primary neuroscience reasons why Freud's idea of repression, that a memory can be so painful that you repress it and can't recall it, why that is almost literally physically impossible without causing widespread amnesia in the brain, because so many of your neural pathways would have to be disabled and so many of them are involved in other memories. That kind of interconnectedness is what causes you to have stream of consciousness thinking, where you think of one thing that triggers off another thought and you follow that, that triggers off something else and you follow that. We're going to see later that kind of processing is what can fire off dreams while you're asleep. Dreams that seem to have nothing to do with anything that happened to you during the day. And we'll see that sometimes they do. Now, coming back to memory, you may have or have not, depending on the classes you've taken, heard of a brain structure called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the key to memory processing. But the hippocampus itself contains no memories. I can completely remove your hippocampus right now. All of your memories will remain there. They'll still be intact. The difference is you'll never be able to lay down another new memory ever again. You'll be in a state that we call anterograde amnesia, where I could be having an experience, a conversation with someone right now. I'm fine as long as I'm talking to them. The moment my attention goes to something else, that completely disappears. The hippocampus is required to hang on to experience and rehearse it and turn it into a long-term memory. So that's a key there. The hippocampus also seems to reinforce older memories. The more I think of things, the more the hippocampus will kind of exercise those pathways that were involved in those memories. So this is why when it comes to memory processing, I had some experience during the day, a bunch of neural pathways fired off together in patterns. When I go to sleep at night, one of the things going on is the pons down in my brainstem, and that's going to be significant again later in REM sleep, because the pons is blocking motor signals during REM going to the body. The pons is also sending signals up into the brain that seems to be firing off or rehearsing pathways that have recently fired. And that seems to reinforce them. The hippocampus is involved in that process as well. And again, that firing of signals and random activity can cause you to dream. Now, we'll hit this again in dreaming When we say dreams, most of the time we're talking about plotted things that we can remember that have some story to them. Literally, though, when we're going to talk about the brain producing dreams, it can be just quick images, sounds, things that flip by very quickly and don't seem to be connected at all, and that's why you won't remember them. There's too many of them. You're having that kind of experience almost all the time you're sleeping, but there's no way to remember those little quick, very quick flipping images. And you're getting those because of pathways that are firing off in the brain. So as far as a student, let's say, for example, you're trying to memorize a list of something and you're having a hard time with it. The best time to work on that list is just the hours before you go to bed. Just work on that list, work on it, work on it. You may feel like you're getting nowhere with it. Quite often when you're trying to memorize something, you can get a feeling you're starting to pick it up, but maybe you're starting to feel tired and you're rehearsing through the list, but you just don't feel like you're encoding anything. When you go to sleep, that list is going to be one of the first things your brain starts consolidating. You'll notice when you wake up in the morning and just try to remember the list, you'll suddenly be remembering a lot more of them than you had the night before. So later in the evening is a good time to study as far as things that you want to recall later. Okay, so one of the researchers that's looked at how sleep processes memory is Stickgold. And we're kind of entering into the dream room here too, because he looks at how memory processing can be reflected in the dreams that you have. Let's take a look at one of his studies here.
So John here is mostly just having a lot of fun. He's learning how to play this game, Alpine Racer 2. And what we think is that as the brain goes to sleep, it's going to come back to these images.
Once John has gone to sleep, Stickgold wakes him through the night to see how his dreams have changed.
I was walking through boot prints in the snow. I already made boot prints, like copying them.
The image that he gets is walking through snow and stepping into the steps that he or someone else had laid down before him. And of course, how much easier it is to walk through the snow if you go exactly where you stepped last time.
In these associations, Stickgold perceives a clear link between dreams and memory.
Yeah, and like we said, we're kind of brushing over memory processing right now because it is probably the single biggest component of what drives dreams. So we'll be hitting that more when we get into dreams and nightmares. It's a huge component in nightmares too. The information your brain pulls up to create a nightmare comes from memory processing, as you can imagine. So the primary piece of that. So a very quick run through on the functions, because the functions are pretty straightforward and basic. We are replenishing, restoring the body. We are flushing toxins out of the brain and processing memory, giving you some downtime to conserve energy at the same time. So all functional in that regard. So we're ready for the next section, in which we are going to look at not just sleep disorders, but the effects of sleep deprivation, which can be devastating if it goes on for too long. Let's head on into that section.